Back when Coldplay and BTS released My Universe in 2021, Chris already sensed Jungkook's vocal potential. In interviews, he mentioned how Jungkook's tone had a brightness, like light through glass. But that was admiration from a collaborator, polite, warm, professional. What he said this time carried another weight. Because Chris wasn't promoting a project. He wasn't being diplomatic. He was reacting to art in its purest form, and that kind of response is the most honest one an artist can give. Inside the studio that day, there was no label executive, no PR manager, no camera recording reactions. It was just sound and instinct. Chris listened again. He asked the engineer to rewind. On the second playback, he closed his eyes. You could almost see his body language change from listening to the song to listening inside it. That's the difference between a casual ear and a musician's ear. One hears melody, the other hears emotion as data. And what he was hearing was evolution. Jungkook's voice had always been technically clean, even from his teenage debut. But now it had grown into something multi-layered, darker in color, yet more open in texture. There was subtle rasp at the edges of sustained notes, a slight drag in the vibrato that gave it a kind of ache. It was deliberate, but not calculated. Controlled chaos. And that's exactly the kind of sound that fascinates someone like Chris Martin. Because it's not just about technique, it's about emotional architecture. When Jungkook sings now, he doesn't just deliver notes, he manipulates space. He knows when to let silence breathe, when to let the sound collapse into vulnerability. That kind of understanding only comes from years of self-study. Chris Martin recognized it instantly because he's walked that same path from the clean, youthful vocals of early Coldplay to the textured intimacy of later albums like Ghost Stories and Everyday Life. Hearing Jungkook, he probably saw the reflection of an artist crossing that same invisible bridge from performer to storyteller. Outside that studio, the rest of the world had no idea what had just happened. But inside, something subtle shifted. Chris looked up and said quietly, "He gets it." It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a calm acknowledgement between musicians who speak the same invisible language. The sound engineer nodded, understanding that this was no longer about a singer impressing a legend. It was about a legend recognizing another artist's truth. It's strange how such a small moment, a single comment, almost whispered, can ripple so far. Within days, Chris's remark began circulating through music circles, picked up by producers, vocal coaches, and even critics. Chris Martin said Jungkook's voice was beautiful. Simple headline, but behind that simplicity was a deep artistic signal. Because when someone with Chris's reputation makes a statement like that, the industry listens. The beauty of this story isn't in the flattery, it's in the why. Why would a seasoned artist be so affected by another's voice? The answer lies in the one thing both men share: an obsession with truth in music. Chris once said that the hardest part about being a musician is remembering that honesty sounds better than perfection. That same philosophy runs through Jungkook's new sound. You can hear it the way he lets his tone crack slightly at emotional peaks, how he rides the line between control and surrender. It's risky, raw, and deeply human. And Chris Martin, who's built his entire career on emotional authenticity, could hear that immediately. Think of it like this. Jungkook's voice in that recording wasn't just an instrument, it was evidence. Evidence of growth, of maturity, of countless nights spent experimenting in silence while the world expected him to stay inside the safe zone of pop perfection. Instead, he chased nuance. He looked for imperfection that felt alive. And when Chris heard that, he recognized it not as a surprise, but as inevitability. Jungkook had arrived at that point every great artist eventually reaches, where the goal isn't to impress, but to express. From the outside, Chris Martin's simple praise, "It makes a good impression for him," might sound casual. But in the lexicon of artists, it's layered. To a veteran musician, a good impression means more than public appeal. It means artistic legitimacy. It's like saying, "This guy is not pretending anymore. He knows what he's doing." That's not a compliment. It's a professional acknowledgement and a powerful one. For Jungkook, who has spent years balancing between idol fame and artistic credibility, this moment marked something invisible but massive. Chris Martin's words weren't validation in the fan sense, they were translation. A bridge between how Jungkook's artistry feels in Korea and how it's now perceived in the West. In one short sentence, Chris reframed him not as a K-pop singer, but as a musician. It's worth imagining what Jungkook himself might have felt hearing that reaction. Maybe he smiled. Maybe he didn't even realize what a shift it caused. Because if there's one consistent thing about him, it's his quiet approach to praise. He's known for thanking people softly, for diverting attention back to the music itself. But those who understand him know, Jungkook is a perfectionist who studies his craft with almost scientific patience. To him, hearing that kind of comment from Chris Martin isn't an ego boost, it's fuel. It's the kind of moment that tells an artist, you're on the right path. And that's what this whole story really represents. Not a meeting between idol and legend, but between two musicians who understand the same invisible pursuit, chasing sound that feels like truth. For Chris Martin, it was a rediscovery of that early passion that made him fall in love with music decades ago. For Jungkook, it was confirmation that his evolution is being seen not by fans, but by the kind of artist whose opinion carries generational weight. So, when we look back at that quiet London studio, the hum of speakers, the faint glow of soundboards, and the moment Chris Martin whispered, "That's beautiful," it wasn't just another reaction. It was history in microcosm. The passing of understanding from one artist to another. The kind of moment that doesn't need a press release, a camera, or a headline because the sound itself said everything. That day, music didn't need translation. It just needed one voice, one listener, and one sentence that would echo across 2 generations of sound. He gets it. Every artist carries a map of their growth inside their voice. You can hear where they started, where they stumbled, and where they finally found balance. Jungkook's new tone was exactly that, a map. It told the story of a singer who had stopped chasing perfection and started chasing depth. The kind of depth that can't be taught, only lived. Chris Martin knows this sound well. It's the same sound he heard in himself years ago, when Coldplay transitioned from stadium-sized anthems to more intimate, stripped-back records. It's the tone that comes when a singer realizes the most powerful thing they can do is let go. What Chris was hearing in Jungkook was not just improved technique, it was ownership. A singer who no longer molds his voice to fit expectations, but shapes the music around his own emotional truth. For most listeners, it's just a change in texture. But to another artist, it's a transformation that's almost spiritual. From a technical standpoint, Jungkook's voice has evolved in ways that are subtle yet striking. His control over air pressure, the balance between breath and tone, has become extraordinarily fine. When he begins a note, it doesn't burst into the space. It glides in, like a wave forming on still water. You can hear it clearly in his recent live performances, where every onset of sound feels intentional. That's a skill born from years of listening to one's own recordings, adjusting the smallest imperfections, experimenting with where the emotion lives inside the breath. But what truly caught Chris Martin's attention was Jungkook's use of texture. Texture is what separates a technically good singer from an emotionally compelling one. It's the grain, the friction, the imperfect vibration that makes a tone human. Jungkook's voice now carries that, a kind of velvety roughness that suggests both control and surrender. It's not the clean sheen of studio tuning. It's real, alive, full of micro movements that reveal how deeply he connects with what he's singing. Chris, as a songwriter who's spent his life exploring the relationship between sound and feeling, understands that texture is emotion translated into frequency. It's what makes a voice reach beyond language. When he heard that in Jungkook, he knew immediately, this is someone who's learning to speak the universal language of musicianship. Another layer that fascinated Chris was Jungkook's phrasing, the way he chooses when to deliver a lyric. In pop, phrasing often follows predictable rhythm, but Jungkook bends it. He plays with time, stretching a syllable just slightly longer than expected, pulling back a line so that it feels suspended in midair. It's the kind of subtle timing that great vocalists use to create tension, to make listeners unconsciously hold their breath. And it's something that can't be faked. It has to come from instinct. Chris could hear that instinct immediately, because he spent decades refining his own. He once said in an interview, "The hardest thing in music is to sound effortless when everything you're doing is deliberate." That's exactly what Jungkook achieved. His new vocal delivery doesn't sound like it's built on layers of practice, though it clearly is. It feels spontaneous, lived in, natural, the mark of a performer who has stopped trying to impress and started trying to communicate. In that London studio, Chris turned to one of the engineers and said, "You can hear the air moving with him. It might sound poetic, but that's actually a deeply technical observation. When you can hear air move in a vocal, the shifts between compression and release, it means the singer isn't over-editing emotion. They're letting the physicality of sound carry feeling. That's what creates intimacy. It's why certain songs make you feel like the artist is whispering directly into your chest. Jungkook has mastered that invisible art, but there's more to it than sound mechanics. What really left an impression on Chris Martin was Jungkook's emotional awareness. In every great singer, there's a moment when they stop performing and start inhabiting their own music. Jungkook's voice had reached that point. He wasn't just interpreting lyrics anymore, he was embodying them. The shifts in tone weren't stylistic, they were emotional responses, captured in real time. Chris could hear the honesty bleeding through. It's the same honesty that defines Coldplay's best songs, the ability to turn vulnerability into something universally powerful. And that's why this connection between the two artists feels so natural. They both see music not as performance, but as a conversation between souls. To Chris, Jungkook's sound now holds the rare quality he calls transparency. In music theory, transparency doesn't mean clarity, it means truthfulness. It means there's nothing hidden between the listener and the artist. Every inhale, every imperfection becomes part of the storytelling. That's why his reaction was immediate. Because when you encounter transparency in a world obsessed with polish, it feels revolutionary. The fascinating part is that this transformation didn't happen overnight. Jungkook has spent years quietly refining his craft, often away from the public eye. Long after concerts end, he's known to spend hours reviewing recordings, studying how his voice interacts with the acoustics of different spaces. He experiments with mic distance, vowel shapes, and emotional color terms that most pop singers rarely think about. This level of dedication isn't glamorous. It's technical, solitary work, but it's what turns talent into mastery. When Chris heard that evolution in Jungkook's new vocal, He was hearing not just a performance, but years of discipline manifesting in one fluid sound. It reminded him of how Coldplay themselves once reinvented their sonic identity. He said before that the key to staying alive as a musician is curiosity. Jungkook embodies that curiosity. He's not content with sounding good. He wants to feel new. The global reaction after Chris's comment only confirmed what insiders already knew: Jungkook's artistry had crossed a threshold. Critics began to describe his voice in technical terms that usually belong to soul or R&B vocalists. Resonance depth, harmonic texture, emotional dynamic range. Those aren't words typically used for pop idols. But that's the point. He's not one anymore. For Chris Martin, that's probably what he meant when he said, "It makes a good impression for him." It wasn't about publicity or reputation. It was about artistic legitimacy. The phrase sounds modest, but to another musician, it's as meaningful as applause. It's one artist telling another, "You're not becoming good, you already are." Some people might think Chris's admiration was influenced by their friendship, but anyone who knows his character knows otherwise. Chris Martin has worked with the biggest artists in the world: Beyoncé, Rihanna, Jay-Z, Brian Eno, and he speaks about music with almost spiritual sincerity. When he finds something real, he says it. When he doesn't, he stays silent. That's why this moment stands out. He didn't have to comment. He chose to. And that choice echoed across the industry. Within weeks, producers who had previously viewed Jungkook as a pop voice began discussing him in the same breath as full-fledged vocalists. Some pointed out how his tone resembles the hybrid qualities of Justin Timberlake in his prime, clean but textured, agile but grounded. Others noted that Jungkook's live stability is now among the best in the industry. And while all these observations add up, the essence remains simple. He sounds real. Chris Martin, above all, responds to real. His entire musical identity is built on it. That's why he once told Jungkook during their early collaboration, "The most beautiful thing you can be is honest." Hearing Jungkook's recent vocal, he must have realized that honesty is now complete. So when people ask what exactly Chris heard that day, the answer isn't a technical list. It's not just about tone, control, or dynamics. What he heard was an arrival, the sound of an artist stepping fully into himself. A voice that has stopped trying to fit a genre and has instead become its own. In the end, that's why Chris's compliment carries so much weight. Because it wasn't flattery, it was recognition. The kind of recognition that one artist gives to another when they know the long, lonely process it takes to find authenticity. When Jungkook sings now, you can feel the lineage of voices behind him, the pop icons, the soul singers, the rock legends, but you can also feel something distinctly his. That's what Chris responded to. Not imitation, not influence, but individuality. And maybe that's why he smiled that day in the studio, quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. He gets it. Because to someone like Chris Martin, that single realization that another artist has found his true sound is the highest compliment you can give.